All right, let's dive straight into this tactical explainer of what was honestly a fascinating 0-0 chess match between Colombia and Portugal. Now, as a coach, when I pop on the game tape of a 0-0 draw, I'm absolutely not looking at the lack of goals. What I am looking at is the spatial control, the environmental adaptation, and the sheer tactical disruption that kept the ball out of the net. Today, we're going to unpack exactly how Colombia took one of the most elite, star-studded European rosters out there and essentially completely neutralized them on the pitch through just pure tactical discipline and brilliant positioning. So here's our game plan for today's session. We're going to map out the environmental battle, diagram the midfield war, outline some final third fixes, analyze the whole Ronaldo situation, and finally, reevaluate Portugal's tournament outlook based on what we saw in the film. Let's get into it. Starting off with Section 1, the environmental tactical battle. Let's see how the extreme Miami weather really set the baseline for this entire clash. Now, you really have to notice the stark contrast in physical readiness between these two squads. We're talking about a 100-degree heat index in Miami and this trapped, completely stagnant air inside the stadium. It created an absolutely suffocating atmosphere. From a purely physiological standpoint, playing in that kind of heat fundamentally alters your muscle recovery, right? Lactic acid builds up way faster, and clearing it out, that takes significantly longer. Portugal looked completely leggy. They were struggling to maintain their usual high-tempo pressing game just because their bodies literally couldn't recover between sprints. But Colombia? They thrive in this. They're totally accustomed to playing their home qualifiers in the intense, humid heat of Barranquilla. They knew exactly when to take their foot off the gas, hold possession in a low block for maybe 60 seconds at a walking tempo just to recover, and then boom, burst back into action. Meanwhile, the Portuguese players just looked visibly drained. There's a great quote from the pundits here, running through water. And look, if you've ever coached or played in these exact conditions, you know it feels exactly like that. You're literally wading through a pool. This environmental toll severely limited Portugal's physical output. It prevented their midfield from getting back into that compact defensive shape when they coughed up the ball during transition moments. It was this massive, invisible tactical advantage, and honestly, Colombia leveraged it beautifully to dictate the tempo of the entire match. Moving on to Section 2. Winning the midfield war. Let's get right into the tactical meat of this match and diagram how Colombia basically dismantled a world-class midfield. So this is exactly where the game was won and lost. On paper, Portugal's midfield trio of Vitinha, Bruno Fernandes, and João Neves is arguably the best in the tournament. I mean, these are guys who dictate the tempo for the absolute top clubs in Europe. But Colombia's tactical response? It was an absolute masterclass in disruption. They didn't just sit back in some passive zone, they were incredibly proactive. They aggressively stepped right onto Vitinha, suffocating his space and just completely shutting down his primary passing lanes. You know, in modern football, the pivot player needs a minimum of 2 seconds to scan and distribute. Colombia gave Vitinha maybe half a second. And whenever Portugal pushed their fullbacks high, Colombia relentlessly exploited those empty spaces left behind Nuno Mendes. They executed these perfectly timed, overlapping runs from Arias and Munoz straight into the half spaces, creating these beautiful 2v1 numerical overloads on the flanks. By isolating the Portuguese defenders like that, they were able to pick out passes from deep that literally sliced Portugal's defensive shape wide open. And that precise spatial control resulted in a staggering 26 shots for Colombia. 26. Just let that sink in for a second. When you totally control the center of the park and completely neutralize the opponent's playmakers, their entire defensive block just begins to collapse under the sustained pressure. That's what leads to this massive volume of opportunities. Colombia completely bypassed Portugal's midfield press. The buildup was flawless. Literally, the only thing missing was that final clinical touch. Which brings us to Section 3, fixing the final third. A 0-0 scoreline obviously means both teams ultimately failed in their final execution. So let's outline the direct coaching instructions needed to fix this. Okay, so if you're the Colombian manager, you are absolutely thrilled with the buildup, right? But the locker room instruction to fix the attack is pretty clear. Step 1, once you gain entry into that final third, you've got to stop forcing it. Step 2, find your composure. We saw Colombian players repeatedly hitting these rushed passes a yard behind runners like Luis Diaz. The game was just moving a fraction too fast for them. So how do you fix that? Well, as a coach, when my attackers are snatching at shots, we run high BPM drills in training. You sprint 40 yards, get your heart rate up to 180, and then you are forced to take a single controlled touch before shooting. You have to actively train that extra millisecond of pause. And finally, step 3, execute a selfish finish. they desperately lacked a killer poacher. The attackers really needed to just take the shot rather than searching for that one extra, totally unnecessary pass inside the box. Now, if I'm Portugal's manager, Roberto Martinez, my instructions are entirely different. Step 1, your midfield has to do the heavy lifting, the donkey work, picking up the defensive slack. Step 2, you have to pin your 41-year-old veteran striker strictly to the width of the 18-yard box. Look, when you have an older forward on the pitch, lateral running is a literal death sentence to their stamina. You tell him, do not drop deep into the midfield to get touches. Stay right between the goalposts and save your legs purely for 3-yard explosive sprints inside the 6-yard box. Let the midfield get the ball wide and you just be the target. And finally, step 3, you absolutely must demand total selfishness from your wingers. And this last point is crucial, guys, because it leads us directly into our next major tactical observation. All right, section 4, the Ronaldo problem. This is a massive tactical and psychological hurdle that Portugal has got to address immediately. Listen to this single number, 0. That is the exact number of attempted take-ons from Portugal's 41-year-old veteran striker across the entire 90 minutes. Let's really break down what that means from a tactical standpoint. In the modern game, your number 9 is your first line of defense and really the focal point of your spatial manipulation. When your striker generates 0 individual threat off the dribble, the opposing defensive block can simply squeeze way higher up the pitch. They just don't have to respect the space behind them. If you review the spatial heat maps from this game, Ronaldo's movement was completely static. Without those sharp diagonal, off-the-ball runs that stretch a defense and actually pull center backs out of position, the entire attacking structure just stagnates. You simply cannot play a high-intensity, modern pressing system with a striker who operates strictly as a stationary target man. Why? Because it forces the rest of your midfield to cover a massive amount of extra ground just to make up for the lack of pressure up top. When I evaluate the game film, it's pretty glaring. There's a quote floating around from the pundit saying, he was an ordinary footballer. And honestly, despite his incredible history and over 900 career goals, in this specific system, he really did look ordinary. He was completely pocketed by the brilliant center back duo of Davinson Sanchez and John Lukume. I mean, their defensive positioning was flawless. They stayed incredibly tight, totally denied him the ability to turn, and comfortably won every single aerial duel. From a defensive coaching perspective, Colombia was perfectly happy to let him stay on the pitch for the full 90 minutes. He wasn't disrupting their defensive line or adding any dynamic threat to the attack whatsoever. And this exposes a severe team chemistry issue that goes way beyond just one player's heat map. Look at the situation right here. Joao Felix gets into a premium 1v1 matchup with the defender. Now, he is a proven goal scorer. Statistically, in terms of expected goals, or XG, taking the shot there is the objectively correct tactical decision. But what does he do? He hesitates. Instead of being selfish and taking the strike, he keeps his head up looking for Cristiano Ronaldo the entire time. Coaches actually call this the hierarchy tax in a dressing room. When your attacking players are passing up high percentage shots because they feel this intense psychological pressure to feed a senior figure who's heavily focused on his own goal count, well, your entire offensive tactical system just breaks down. It is absolutely fascinating to contrast the movement patterns and leadership dynamics across these two teams. On one side, you have Portugal's over-reliance on a fading star, which is creating stagnant off-the-ball running and honestly stifling their younger talent. But on the other side, look at Colombia's 22-year-old Gustavo Porta. The kid's work rate is phenomenal. He's this unsung hero stepping up, constantly making himself available in the half spaces and playing with the intense off-the-ball running that's required to dictate the flow of a modern game. Colombia's young players are clearly empowered to take risks, while Portugal's young stars just appear incredibly hesitant. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Reevaluating Tournament Dark Horses. Let's put on our pundit hats, zoom out, and evaluate what this tactical tape means for the upcoming knockout rounds. So the red flags for Portugal are waving intensely right now. Their world-class midfield was completely overrun and exposed. Their physical conditioning looked highly suspect in the heat, and their attacking rhythm is totally broken by an over-reliance on a static striker. And next up in Toronto, they face Croatia. Look, Croatia is a fiercely tournament-hardened team that knows exactly how to drag games into deep, muddy waters. If Colombia's midfield just exposed Portugal's inability to control the center of the park, just imagine what a veteran Croatian midfield is going to do to them. Portugal's status as a tournament dark horse is rapidly fading. Conversely, Colombia has a massive tactical advantage moving forward. They prove they can absolutely control the center of the pitch to neutralize elite European playmakers. They combine these relentless work rates with a highly sophisticated pressing blueprint.
Their ability to adapt to extreme weather, combined with their dynamic youth leadership, makes them an absolute nightmare matchup for anyone. They are seriously proving that they are miles better than people expected.
So I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up today's tactical session. Will Portugal's stubborn tactical loyalty to a declining legend be their ultimate downfall? Or can Roberto Martinez somehow fix this broken locker room chemistry and rediscover their midfield magic before it's too late? It's a massive question, and it's one that will undoubtedly define the rest of their tournament. Thanks so much for joining me on the chalkboard for this explainer. Keep your eyes on the tactics, and I'll see you next time.